Hey y'all, Molly here. I wanted to let our listeners know that this podcast, The Science of Memory and Surprising Things That Might Be Messing with Our Memory, I recorded this podcast before the coronavirus pandemic, before the stay at home orders, before all of this that has happened. So you won't hear mention of that throughout the podcast or throughout my interview with our guest. And I wanted, though, to still share this with you because I feel like this topic is incredibly relevant and probably more now than ever. We know that stress is one of the things that has a huge impact on our memory, our ability to retain information, to understand, process information. And I think it's safe to say that we are all under a great amount of stress worldwide than possibly globally, collectively, at one point, the entire world has experienced together. And so when we look at stress, we look at memory. I thought it was really timely to share. And a lot of us have been, I think all of us are forgetting what day of the week it is at points when we are, during this stay at home period. But we do have people in our lives that I know many of us are concerned about. We may have seen a slip in memory, and maybe we've seen that happen a little bit more quickly now. We know that mental stimulation is key for cognition, for memory, and staying at home, staying in one place, not having exposure to multiple people, places, experiences, it's not good for our brains. And so I think that it's especially timely to hear this. And so with that, here's the podcast in full. I'm Molly Kimball. Welcome to Fueled, a wellness and nutrition podcast. I'm a registered dietitian and nutrition journalist with a passion to help people live their strongest, healthiest life possible. In my weekly TV segments and columns, there's a limited amount of time and space to cover everything, but there's so much more to share. This podcast is my opportunity to dive deeper into the topics you want to know about. In today's episode, we are taking a look inside the science of memory. Because our memories define us. They become the story of who we are. And the more information that we accumulate, the more time that passes, the harder it can seem to hold on to all of those memories. And we all know those people who have just crazy good memories. They can recall every detail from decades ago, the things that are just kind of fuzzy to us, or we might not even remember them at all. It's as if they never happened. That friend, that family member, they know every last detail of that scenario. Meanwhile, we are still struggling to remember the name of our new neighbor or our coworker. And a lot of us, really, quite frankly, it feels like it's chronic information overload, whether it's through work, through social media, traditional media. We are flooded with facts, with data, with information. And it feels like it's impossible sometimes for our brains to sort through what to keep and what to let go of. But fortunately, we can train our brains to remember better, to remember more, and to absorb new information more effectively. And improving our memory doesn't have to be a giant undertaking. There are so many everyday things that we're doing that we don't even realize are harming our memories. And there are things that we can add into our lives on a regular basis to enhance our memories. But first, let's talk about how our memory works so that we can really understand the science of how we can improve it. And to get us started, I want to welcome Dr. Alan Towfigh. He is the medical director of New York Neurology and Sleep Medicine, and he's also a clinical instructor at Weill Cornell Medical College. And thank you, Dr. Towfigh. I'm so excited for you to join us to share your insight and guidance on the science of memory.
Thanks, Molly. Great to be here.
So you do a lot of researching, instructing on this topic. Tell us a bit about your background, and then let's dive into it.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a medical director of New York Neurology and Sleep Medicine in Manhattan, as you mentioned. I do a lot of clinical work as a neurologist. So a lot of my time is spent with patients who will often come in with concerns regarding their own memory. And a lot of times concerns and anxiety over whether or not their memory is failing them specifically with a lot of anxiety around the topic of dementia. So it'd be great for people to learn more about what type of symptoms they should be concerned about, but more importantly, what they can do to really keep their memory as primed and well functioning as possible for as long as possible.
So is it possible to even explain just in a very layperson way, and I know it's giant, but how our memory works? Because it's fascinating. It's like these occurrences, these images, these even feelings, they stick and they're imprinted in there. But what does that look like? How do you describe that?
Yeah, so memory, if you want to break it down into two categories, broadly speaking, there's a more factual memory, which is names and dates and historical facts. And then there's procedural memory, things like how do you tie your shoe, or how do you get from point A to point B if you're driving a car. And they're both designed as sort of circuits within the brain. So when you're trying to retrieve a memory, neurons will fire down a very sort of a hardwired pathway where neuron A and neuron B will be interacting directly with one another to retrieve a name or a date or a detail. And same with driving, you'll tap into a circuit which will guide you in terms of which neurons fire when, kind of directing you to make a right turn or get on the on-ramp or off-ramp as you need to go. So it's all just circuits within the brain which end up fusing together. And the most important part there is that ability to develop new memories. As we get older, that tends to fade. Sort of as the adage goes, it's harder to teach an old dog new tricks. And that's because the ability for new pathways to be formed does tend to diminish as we get older.
So that's the key. If we can try to slow that process from happening, to slow that, or slow the diminishment of it. So basically keep those pathways activated, keep them alert, keep us to where...
Keep your brain younger.
Yeah. And I think we all know the people who, you can have a conversation with someone who, maybe it's a grandparent, and they can be two people who are the exact same age. And one, you feel like they're current on things, they're hip, they understand what's current trends. They're the ones who have their smartphone and they're doing all types of things that you're like, well, they just get it. And they don't bat an eye. Others, that seems like a very cumbersome chore. And a lot of that is probably what you just described as well.
Yeah, precisely. Everyone's got a chronologic age and a biologic age. And the goal is to keep that biological age as low as possible, despite you growing older chronologically.
And what happens in our brains when we forget, even if we're not talking about loss of memory as we age, but is that too complicated to get into here? Just like, when you're trying to remember something, like it just... Either we're trying to remember someone's name or a thing, or we simply don't remember an event that happened, even though it was just a couple of years ago.
Yeah, it's pretty. I mean, the brain is pretty complicated, and I think maybe what you're referring to are those senior moments where you'll just have a much more difficult time retrieving a certain memory. And there's so many things that play into how quickly your brain can retrieve information. And it's a myriad of things, from how much sleep you got the night before, how distracted you might be, how preoccupied you are with all the different things you need to do that day. And perhaps as we get older, something that becomes really important is how many medications you're on and which medications you're on, because those also have an impact on how well the brain functions.
So let's talk about this, because there's things that you say are surprising, and things that I've read that you've talked about in the past, surprising, that we don't realize influences our memory. So starting with diet and nutrition, what are some foods or types of diets that are linked to impaired memory? And then what are those that can actually help us?
I think using very common sense guidelines goes a long way. So you don't want to have foods that have a really high glycemic index, which are going to really bottom out your glucose level. Your brain depends so much on how much glucose is readily available. So after you have a really large meal, or if you have a really huge sugar load, often people will feel that they're sluggish and their ability to focus and concentrate does go down. And a part of that, maybe not all of it, but a part of it is due to how much sugar and was in the diet, and how much your insulin levels do peak. And we've all kind of felt very sluggish towards midday as well. So that's to some extent related to how much you may have had and what you've had to eat at lunchtime. But also biologically, we all tend to hit a dip in the late afternoon. And that's just a part of our own innate circadian rhythm, which tends to go into a bit of a lull in the afternoon. And entire cultures revolve around this circadian rhythm and have a thing called siesta, which some viewers may be familiar with. So the diet is important. The time of day is also important. And
going back just a minute to the high glycemic. So I think that that's key because, as a dietitian, we're always encouraging people for so many reasons, steer clear of white refined carbohydrates, steer clear of sugars, especially those added sugars. And when we look at those as far as inflammation, their effect on weight, all these things, that's a reason. But the fact that they can also interfere with our ability to remember is just one more reason. Let me ask about that. Is it more an acute effect that it has, that it's right in that time frame that we're having it? Or is it a diet chronically high in these foods impairs it over time?
It's both. It's definitely both. It does have an acute effect. And one could even argue that if you time it correctly, if you take a huge sugar load, it may actually help improve memory for a very brief period of window, just because, again, you're flooding glucose into the system. But over time, if your diet is heavily based on refined, simple sugars, that's going to lead to a lot of downstream effects, such as a higher risk of diabetes, such as a higher inflammatory index when you're looking at inflammatory markers, which can lead to damage not only to the brain itself, but also to the blood vessels that supply the brain. And this is a very complicated area because there's the complexity of running a study to make clear associations between what these effects would have on the brain are so costly that I don't think they've ever been done in a very
really hard
large
to
scale.
Thread out what's really affecting it.
Right, but we know what the effects of a chronically deficient diet or a diet that's too heavily based on simple sugars has on the rest of the organs. And the brain is no different. So yeah, use common sense guidelines, I think, goes a long way.
And then what about any like foods, nutrients, types of diets that can actually help our memory?
I think caffeine is a great one. When used appropriately, caffeine can absolutely help improve memory. And I think a part of the reason it does that is because it actually blocks the adenosine receptors, which tend to induce more fatigue and kind of a brain fog, as well as an overall sense of lethargy. And we've all had a cup of coffee in the morning, and some of us can't get our day started without it. And that's a part of the reason why is it does tend to improve our ability to focus and concentrate, and improve memory goes along with that.
So our coffee lovers are rejoicing right now.
Indeed, yeah.
And then tell me about lifestyle, the benefits of exercise on memory, but then conversely, if someone has a very sedentary, habits, how does this affect us?
So I think lifestyle is such a huge factor. And a few things in particular. One is making sure you get adequate sleep. So sleep is interesting because it does so many things to help improve our cognition. One of them is simply to allow the brain to rest and the body to rest, so that when you're starting your day, again, you want your fatigue to be completely dissipated, and you want to wake up feeling refreshed. If you're not waking up feeling like you're ready to start your day, you've really got to look at why that is. Either your sleep quantity might be deficient, or if you're getting adequate sleep, which for most people is between 7 and 9 hours, then you've got to start looking at why the quality may be impaired. And things like sleep apnea or a different sleep disorder may be to blame. So under no circumstance should you wake up and not feel ready to start your day when you get started in the morning. The other thing that sleep does is actually helps improve memory during that period where you're sleeping. So the brain actually goes through a lot of events that it experienced during the day, and it decides what information it wants to store and keep, and what information it wants to discard and not ever have to worry about again. And so they've done really interesting studies on the ability to learn new material. And they've had groups learn material, wait 4 hours or 6 hours, and then apply that new information. And they've had another group that learned the same information, only in that 4 to 6 hour window for group number 2, they were allowed to take a nap or go to bed and sleep. And consistently, the group that's allowed to sleep in between the learning and the application outperforms the one that stays awake during that period. So learning is a huge factor for sleep itself. So getting adequate sleep is absolutely important.
And if there's things that we're really trying to make sure we retain, like say someone's studying for an exam, would it make sense? Of course, you're going to study through your normal times of the day, but would it make sense to review some of that in those hours before bedtime? Because it's
absolutely
okay.
Yeah, it makes such a difference. And if you do review a few key concepts right before you go to bed, you will outperform on those areas when you wake up in the morning.
Because I find whatever was the last thing I looked at or read or anything before bed, it's in my dreams, and I'm thinking about it, and you're still processing it. And I've read, and you can explain more, but what's happening physically inside of the brain at night, our brains aren't resting. They're really active. And I've read it described as like they're cleaning up, and that the cells actually shrink to allow fluid to come through these cells. Can you kind of describe what happens there? Or is that the case?
I'm not familiar with the size of the cells as you go through the sleep phases, but I can tell you that sleep is actually another area of focus of mine. And sleep is definitely not a passive activity as we've believed it to be for hundreds of years. Now that we have the capability to analyze the brain through both functional MRI as well as EEG, when we analyze people's brains when they're sleeping, we do see a significant amount of activity in various parts of the brain during that period. And that activity is certainly responsible for, in part, consolidating and retaining those memories.
And I have a Fitbit, the Charge 3, and it monitors sleep. And when you look at the report, it'll give you, and I actually think it's pretty accurate because it tells you when your REM was, when your deep was, when your light sleep is. What's your opinion of these just in general?
To my knowledge, the commercially available devices which monitor sleep and monitor sleep phases have not been scientifically standardized. So we don't use those in the medical lab when we're studying patients. I do think it's exciting that patients and the public in general is more aware and is now paying far more attention to sleep. I do think it's a really great pivot from the previous culture, which found sleep to be more of a luxury as opposed to something that's really critically important to our overall health and longevity. But I think there's also a long way to go before we can really rely on the data that we're getting commercially, but certainly an amazing and commended first step towards
starting the conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the reason I say that I do feel like it's accurate, when it does mark the REM time, especially in those hours right before I sleep, I feel like, or the awake times, I feel like they're pretty in line. But yeah, so that if someone's listening, that's kind of just an easy way to also start to gauge your sleep, to start to try to challenge to get at least that 7 hours of sleep. And so talk it to us about sleep, and then we were going to talk about physical activity and movement and how this affects memory.
Very important. So as far as the immediate effects go, the more physically active you are, the more blood is circulating, right? So the more you move, the more your heart has to pump the blood all the organs. And as a result, the more blood you're going to get to the brain as well as everywhere else. That's going to lead to a couple things. Number one, your kidneys and liver is going to get more blood pumped to those organs. So you're going to filter the blood more effectively and get a lot of those toxins out. And number two, There's going to be more blood going to the brain. But also another really key part here is your muscles, which people don't always associate with your brain. But what we're learning is when you're more physically active, a lot of the organs, including the muscles, are actually taking a lot of byproducts and filtering them out, which would otherwise accumulate and become neurotoxic and cause more brain damage over the years. So I think exercise and physical activity is of utmost importance. But in addition to that, when you look at the group that is more sedentary, you're also going to find worse dietary habits, and you're going to find a higher rate of depression. And we know that depression itself is also an independent risk factor for memory loss, in addition to all the other factors that contribute. So the individuals that are more social and more active are definitely going to outperform and have a healthier memory and brain health than the ones that don't.
When it comes to physical activity and brain health or memory, I feel like when I'm moving, like that time in motion, whether it's, had been going for a jog or a walk or doing the elliptical or something, and I might be kind of stumped on something that I'm writing or how to word something or something creative that I'm trying to come up with that content. It's so much easier to come to me whenever I'm moving. And I guess that's the blood flow, the oxygenation, maybe lack of distractions from other things.
Certainly possible. Yeah, I think ultimately you want to stay engaged and stay active. And I think you're going to get benefits doing that.
And you mentioned depression. So depression, mood disorders directly correlated with impaired memory. And what is the effect of chronic stress or chronically elevated levels of cortisol on our brains?
Well, again, that's one of those questions that becomes hard to base on the scientific data since it's such a difficult thing to try to analyze scientifically. But you can extrapolate that when people have a lot of stress, they have higher levels of cortisol, which is likely going to mean that your sympathetic system's far more active. And when that happens, you tend to have a higher incidence of vascular injury to the blood vessels that supply the organs, including the brain. And so it can lead to a lot of downstream effects, including the development of what's called atherosclerosis, which is irregularities within the blood vessels, which increase your risk of having little tiny either silent strokes or TIAs, or as we get older, what's scientifically termed microvascular ischemia, which means you're getting little tiny blockages in the blood vessels that supply the brain. And every time that happens, you're losing brain cells. So trying to control your stress and trying to control your cortisol levels will lead to a more healthy and longer life.
And better sleep, more movement can help with these medications if needed. If it's clinical depression, someone may be doing everything, but seeking help when needed.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's an area that can be very frustrating for many people, and mental health is such a huge cost to and burden to society. But definitely doing everything you can to try and overcome it, because if you don't, the alternative is certainly not going to be a good one.
Right. And talk about the top three, especially here in the South, the top three: blood pressure, diabetes, high cholesterol, and how this trio impacts our memory.
Yeah, I think those are really important because all three of the things you mentioned are huge vascular risk factors. And by that, I mean they're a risk of causing strokes and TIAs. And what a lot of people don't realize, which is interesting when they come to see me, is your brain can compensate for so much injury before you actually start noticing the brain is beginning to fail. So you have a lot of reserve capacity, which allows us to compensate for bad decision-making and poor lifestyle habits for decades. Right. And it's important to recognize that because even if you're not having symptoms of memory loss, if you're engaging in bad lifestyle behaviors, or if you have high blood pressure and high cholesterol, which remains silent for so many years, it doesn't mean that it's not impacting you. It just means that you're able to overcome that impact. But it still warrants a lot of attention because you're going to start developing those little tiny white spots, which over not just days and weeks, but months and years and decades end up accumulating and lead to a lot of vascular burden, as it's called, when you get older, meaning that a lot of your brain ends up becoming injured, and you have to now perform the same tasks that you did before with less brain power. And so it's really important to try to preserve your brain and control all those factors as soon as you identify them, and make sure you're going to the doctor, make sure you're exercising as much as you can and sleeping as much as you can, because these are things that really creep up on you if you're not paying attention.
And talk to us about medications. You mentioned that right as we started, that certain medications are not great for memory.
Yeah, like everything in life, you take something to improve part A and it has an adverse effect in part B. And anyone who's had the experience of opening up the little disclaimer that comes with their medications can read a long litany of possible side effects that every medication can have. So it is important to talk to your doctor when you're prescribed a new medication and make sure you understand all the possible side effects, so that when you're trying to improve one thing, you're not sacrificing another.
And unfortunately, some of the things that we talked about, just now, depression or anxiety, some of those medications for those can also impair memory, it seems.
They can, and that becomes a double-edged sword.
Right.
Because on one hand, the medication can impair it, but on the other hand, so can the underlying issue itself. So it's always important to talk to your doctor, make sure you understand all the possible side effects, and to always start a medication with a really low dose and go up slowly. Don't just dive into the deep end of the pool, as you will. And sometimes it's helpful to keep a journal and write things down, because it's difficult to ascertain how you're doing in retrospect unless you've got notes as you go along.
And that's what I was also going to say. If you are, and correct me if I'm wrong, but some of the others that I've read, anxiety meds, antidepressants, and some of these can, but also things like statins, beta blockers, sleep aids, Benadryl. So if you have cholesterol, it can affect our memory, but some of the meds might affect it as well. And same with sleep. So if you are in this kind of double-edged sword, as you said, and you either have that condition or you're taking meds to treat it that might affect your memory, knowing that that's the case going in and kind of preparing for it, and whether it's keeping a journal of symptoms or even just starting to, if you haven't been a list maker before or you haven't really written things down, you always relied on memory, maybe realize that this might affect it. And so taking these other steps to help counter that.
Definitely. And you touched on a really important factor as well, which are the over-the-counter meds, which a lot of people don't recognize, certainly can have a lot of adverse effects. And Benadryl is a notorious one, or diphenhydramine, which has a significant impact on memory and cognition. But because it's sold over the counter, a lot of patients don't recognize that. And it's the most commonly prescribed medication over the counter for sleep aids.
Right.
So these patients that are taking their Tylenol PMs and Advil PMs and Unisoms don't expect those medications to have the kind of side effects they do. But it's always important to mention, to not only read the label, but also to discuss it with your doctor before you start any medication, even if it's just over the counter.
And then also to that point too, if you see it and you think, I don't want to do this, I'm already struggling with memory, talk with your physician before you stop it as well, especially if it's a prescription medication.
Definitely.
And we've talked about medications. What about supplements? Are there any supplements that have, science behind it to show that it could be beneficial when it comes to, of course, a lot of people are interested in, well, what could I take? People want to know, what could I eat for a good memory? What can I take for a good memory?
Yeah, it's a tough area. The supplements world is kind of the Wild West. And for some reason, the FDA really doesn't oversee what's going on in the supplement world. And what that means, more importantly, is that it's unregulated. And a lot of supplements can make wild claims that are completely unchecked. And more importantly, there's not a lot of evidence in terms of the data that is done and the research that's done to support the claims that are made. So it becomes very difficult, not only for people to know what effect it's going to have, but also for doctors to really know what effect it's going to have, because what we rely on as physicians is the scientific data for what we're prescribing. And in supplements, that just doesn't exist. So
for any, like there's not a single supplement you would say, yeah, this would, even if it falls under the category of may help, won't hurt.
The won't hurt is where I fall short.
Right.
Because even things that may help, you just don't know. And, there's enough evidence that caffeine can help memory. But if you take a caffeine pill, it's certainly going to have a lot of unwanted side effects, whether it's insomnia, panic attacks, anxiety. So, I certainly in my own practice don't recommend supplements routinely. And even when patients bring them in and ask me about them, I make it very clear to them that we just don't know because the evidence is not there. So you may find that you think you're taking a medicine that's going to help with A, but the only thing worse than having it have a negative impact on point B is not even knowing or recognizing that that's a possibility. So I would take anything over the counter as a supplement with caution.
Okay. And then lastly, on the things that can negatively impact memory, let's talk about hearing and hearing loss. I think we all know that someone in our lives that has trouble hearing. And I find that sometimes I think, did that person not remember what I said, or did they not hear what I said?
Yeah, that's an important point you bring up. And you're not alone in that. And when it comes to hearing, it's really interesting because number one, you're absolutely right. They may not have heard what you said. But in addition to that, it also makes patients who have hearing difficulties less engaged. And again, that takes that also falls into when you're less engaged, you're less social, you can also become somewhat depressed. So there's another element that you have to consider. And in addition to that, if that wasn't enough, the part of your brain which is responsible for hearing sound and translating that into meaningful language, when it's not getting any input from the ears because you can't hear well, that part of the brain, which is so intimately related to your ability to speak and retain language, also begins to falter. So you'll find that people with hearing loss, if untreated, will also start developing deficits in language and memory. And it's because of that interaction. So it's really important to make sure that if you do have hearing loss, that you're addressing that and getting it treated to prevent all these downstream effects.
And that can be a real challenge, I think we all know people we're close to, and that's a challenge. Tell me about the brain games. Like, I love the jumble in the newspaper. A lot of people do Sudoku. What about these different, whether it's kind of the pen and paper brain games or computer stimulating ones? What's your thought on that as far as their ability to process new information or help with our memory?
I mean, I think being active is always a positive. So I always encourage patients to find something they enjoy doing and doing it. What I can tell you scientifically is no one's looked at those studies either to see whether or not doing these anecdotal games are going to improve memory directly. But the more you stay engaged, the better off you're going to be. And the things that we know impact memory are age and education level. So the more educated you are, the more you're retaining and processing new information, the better. And I kind of think in that regard, being more of a reader and staying engaged to acquire new information tends to have a better impact, at least a more proven impact than it does to do these games that are being sold.
Right.
And I know that to the latest knowledge that I have, the disclaimers that these games were making in terms of having a positive impact and warding off things like cognitive impairment and dementia were actually cited by, if not the FDA, a different government agency, as claims that they should not be making because there is, as of now, no evidence that that's true. So if you enjoy doing them, that's great. I certainly encourage people to continue doing things they enjoy. But if you're doing it for the purpose of improving their memory, I don't think that information necessarily supports it. And I would recommend they just simply continue trying to read and go to lectures and attend seminars where they're actually gaining more knowledge, because I think that has a much more well-established link to warding off memory loss.
And so then to wrap up with this, what are your top recommendations for people when it comes to, especially the questions, of course, as a nutritionist that I get a lot is what can I eat? But what are your top things that you would say from diet to sleep to movement, like what's your kind of just rundown list of if you want to help train your brain to work better, if you want to protect your brain, protect your memory, what are some of your
Yeah,
tops?
I think honestly, if you look at kids, at least when I was a kid, all we would do is play and run around. And I think that is such an integral part that I think as we get older, we lose touch with, right? So as we get older, we tend not to play as much. We certainly don't run around as much. And I think that's really harmful because if you can socialize and exercise, those two things do so much to help improve your overall health, including your memory. And if you add sleep and diet to that, I think you've kind of got a winning strategy. So if you have a sensible diet, which I don't necessarily recommend being restrictive on, I just simply recommend having very simple guidelines which you can follow and just break the rules every now and again and have your cheat days where you can indulge yourself. But for most of the week, try to have a sensible set of guidelines for what you're eating and how much you're eating, and then getting enough sleep, and then making sure you're making plans with friends and going out and being social, and also getting to the gym and exercising. I think if you do those four things and you're going to the doctor to make sure you're identifying any other risk factors, like the ones you mentioned, the high blood pressure, the high cholesterol, then I think you've got a winning strategy there.
And last question for us, as far as diet, would it make sense to, one of the, our approach that, we typically recommend with people through this podcast, through other things, is a diet that's really centered on an anti-inflammatory style diet. And it seems that that would also be in line with what would help to protect our brains and our memories.
Yeah, I think that would certainly be great. And I know there's a lot of different diets you can choose from out there. But ultimately, I have an aversion to the word diet because it has such a stigma to it.
It's you're on it or off it, right?
Yeah, just have a healthy lifestyle and just use common sense and learn to read labels and learn to understand what labels mean. And, track that and track your weight. If you're overweight, and everyone knows what weight they're happy at and most fit at. And if you're above that, you should work to get down. And if you're where you want to be, you should work to stay there. And ultimately, and even weight is more of an arbitrary number to me, because you can weigh a lot, but if you've got a really high amount of muscle mass and lean muscle mass, then that becomes almost arbitrary as well. But just have a healthy lifestyle, have sensible guidelines for your own diet, make sure you're exercising and getting enough sleep and socializing. And those things kind of lead you to where you want to be.
Fantastic. And all of these are things that are good for our bodies anyway. And this gives us even a more stronger reason to follow through with them.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, especially when it comes to diet, it's such a hard thing to change. And people are so resistant to changing what they eat. But yeah, if you can get over that and meet with a dietitian, and try to learn foods that you enjoy eating. The goal for patients shouldn't be to be on a diet that makes their life miserable. They should be able to find foods they enjoy eating and having fun with it and just having it be sensible. And there's a lot of options out there. And so people who maybe overly rely on fast food diets and are just too busy to take the time to really pay attention to what they're eating, they can get around that excuse if they just sit down and make it a priority. So I think it's really important to do.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Towfigh. I really appreciate your time with us.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Great to be on.
All right. And I will include the link to your website and our podcast episode so our listeners can find you. All right. Thank you.
Wonderful. All right. Take care.
Bye. All right. So as Dr. Towfigh mentioned, and we were discussing the very things that are key for enhancing our memory, helping those new facts stick and helping to retain those old memories. The very things that help us in those areas are good stuff for our bodies anyway, things that we want to be doing for our bodies, things that we've talked about before on this podcast. And for a variety of reasons, whether it's weight, energy, mood, cravings, all kinds of stuff, these habits are good for our bodies. So first and foremost, sleep. Over and over and over, we look at sleep as helping to embed those memories, helping to imprint those memories in our brains. And that's something that's hard for me. It's hard for a lot of us, I know, but making it a priority and looking at sleep as that third pillar. There's diet, there's physical activity, and there's sleep. And for a lot of people, we think about how much we move and we think about what we eat, but we're really not giving such recognition to how much we sleep. So, aiming for that 7 to 9 hours, looking at are you getting that time in there? And then also, what's your sleep quality? And as you mentioned, obviously, in their labs, they're not using something like a Fitbit Charge 3, understandably. But for those of us looking to track it just on our own, if you have a Fitbit or something like that that tracks sleep, start looking at it and see. And while it might not be exactly accurate, it'll at least show you trends and you can kind of start to see on average what your sleep duration is. You can see it breaks it down to how much REM sleep, how much light sleep, how much deep sleep. And again, while it might not be so precise, it can at least show you trends of how you're comparing night over night or week over week. And so I think that that can be beneficial and it really helps us to kind of gauge where we're starting in the world of sleep and also help us gauge our progress as we're trying to get more regular sleep in. So when we look at what do we know without a doubt is going to help us with imprinting these new memories, retaining old memories, sleep, sleep, sleep. So we've got to do that. The other is, and I've got to work on that myself. That is, that is a constant focus of mine to try to get more sleep, and sometimes that means not fitting everything in that we want to, and that's okay because we're going to function better when we do have that minimum 7 hours of sleep. And if it means that one less thing doesn't get done, okay, we need to accept that. The other is getting social, and whether that if your job is very social, well, that can provide that built-in stimulation right there. If it isn't, then we really need to seek it out. So if you're somebody that works out of your house, you have a home office and you may not have that much interaction, we've got to really make sure that you're making those plans with friends, or you might do some work from coffee shops, things that are going to just get you social, get you interacting. And the other thing is being really social and social in real life, not social with what our phones are. And how many times do we see people walking down the street, literally walking down the street, and they're engaged in their phone and missing the very opportunities to be social right in front of them. So making eye contact with people, saying hello, asking how things are, wishing them a happy whatever it is, if it's a holiday or a big weekend or whatever, ask them what's going on. And even if it's somebody you don't really know, simply greeting them, waving at them, going out, and then maybe that strikes up that little bit of a conversation. And it's also just, for me, rewarding because there's always those little conversations that you come away from and you go, man, that was really nice and unexpected. And so getting social, getting sleep, movement. So if that's going to the gym, if it's walking outside with a friend or your significant other, y'all know I'm a big fan of the walk and talk. It's a big twofer for me. You can get that conversation, talk through all the things you want to talk through, whether it's a work walk and talk or a walk and talk with my husband, but it's also getting that movement, that oxygenation, that blood flow going. And I mentioned in my conversation with Dr. Towfigh, for me, that's a big source of creativity is having that movement. And that's when the ideas come. And that's when, if I have that mental block, that block seems to get unstuck whenever I do have that physical movement. Maintaining a healthy weight, which we talk about a lot, nutrition, of course, through this podcast, anti-inflammatory diet. Of course, Dr. Towfigh is not one to recommend diet, as he said, but everybody wants to know, what do I eat? So when we talk about an anti-inflammatory diet, that's going to be largely, if you've listened to this podcast before, it's what we're almost always talking about. So when we look at what foods cause inflammation, they're pro-inflammatory: white carbs, sugars. Those have that high glycemic impact that he mentioned that is immediately can be damaging to memory, and then chronically can be damaging to memory as well. So pro-inflammatory foods, white carbs, and sugars, those are instantly the first things that we want to make sure we're really trimming out from our diet. Fried foods, deep fried foods, foods high in trans fats. These are going to be pro-inflammatory. So those are the things that I would look at getting our sugary drinks, sugary food, white carbs, pulling those out ASAP. And same with deep fried foods. No secret there. There's a lot of reasons we need to do it. And the fact that they can help, pulling them out can help with memory even better. But then when we look at, well, what do we want to have in place? Of course, produce, our vegetables, our fruits. When we're looking at proteins, oily fish, the omega-3 rich fish. So our salmon is going to be fantastic. Adding in plant-based fats. So our avocado, our avocado oil, olive oil, nuts, nut butters, seeds, all of these things are going to be our great plant-based fats to add in. So when we're looking at these things, these are not new. These are things that we talk about often. But when we look at the effect of them on these habits on our waistline, we look at it on our mood, on our cravings, on all of these things that we've talked about in relation, and chalk up better memory for that as well. Dr. Towfigh mentioned checking labels, so, if you're eating things like avocado and berries, you probably aren't going to have a label on it, but those foods that do have a label on it, and we want to eat more of those foods that many of them don't have the label. Those real fruits, vegetables. But for the foods that do have a label, now food makers are required to include added sugar. Some are still slow to put that label on there, but more and more you're able to see added sugar. So if you're looking at something on a label, let that be one of the first things that you are going for, that your eye is looking to. So those are going to be some of the top things that we'd recommend to help boost our memory, improve brain health. And then, the other things that we talked about, if you've got conditions like blood sugar, diabetes, high cholesterol, the more we can manage these with diet, with lifestyle versus medication, the better, for the reasons that we just talked about too. With a lot of these medications have side effects that they themselves may impair memory. So the more that we can control these things with diet, with lifestyle, even better. Turning to medications, of course, when we need to. If we've got hearing issues or people in our lives do, really encourage them to seek help for that, because there's a lot that alone can lead to memory loss. It can be perceived as memory loss because they're not hearing us, but I thought that was a great explanation Dr. Towfigh gave us of how it actually changes the parts of our brain that's processing, and also our speech and everything else. So I think, it's not something to take lightly. And then finally, if you are in a situation, for me, I'm a big list maker. I write everything down. I know that if I hear something or I say I'm going to do something, there's a lot of different things through the day that I'm doing or committing to or say I'm going to do. And if I don't write it down, I'm likely to forget. So we need to know ourselves. And if that's you, or even if it didn't used to be you, but it is you now, maybe your job has changed or whatever's changed and you have more role or a greater role or more responsibility, start keeping that list. That list can be on your phone. It can be a pen and paper. It can be whatever it is, but not always relying on our memory alone, because we're not always going to, there might be an information overload and we're not able to pull from it. So I hope that you have some takeaway from this. The final thing I would say is with memory, if you always have kind of, coasted and you're always about the same, there's things that that you're forgetful, or you have a lot going on in your day, and sometimes you completely forget that you committed to something or you didn't put something in your calendar. That's normal, and that's how you've always been. But obviously, if there's a significant change in that memory, if it's significantly worse in yourself or in somebody that's close to you, that's when, it may be a cause for concern, and to talk with a physician about it to see, do we want to explore this further? But I think if a lot of us are status quo, whether we think that's a good memory or not, if it's always been that way, it's always been that way. But when there's a sudden change or significant change, that's when I would also, again, seek help. So lots of information that we learned from Dr. Towfigh today. And kind of a reinforcement of a lot of the things that we need to do for our whole body health can also benefit our brains and our minds. So I'm grateful to Dr. Towfigh for joining us today, and I will include the link that he mentioned, his website, in the show notes of this episode. And I am Molly Kimball, and you've been listening to Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, the podcast. And if you would like more Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, please head over to mollykimble.com and you can follow me, Molly Kimble RD, on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And if you haven't yet, please go to Apple Podcasts and subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. And join us next week for another dose of fueled wellness and nutrition. Thanks for listening, and stay focused on living your strongest, healthiest life.